Let's move on to our informational item, the 2022-23 Washtenaw Intermediate School District General Fund Budget Resolution. Dr. Swift.
Thank you, Madam President and trustees. We have joining us via Zoom Mr. Brian Marcel from the Washtenaw Intermediate School District. Hi, Brian. Great to see you.
Hey, Dr. Swift. Good to see you.
I know that Trustee Kelly and perhaps other trustees, I'm not sure, Trustee Gaynor, have already reviewed this over at your Washtenaw board meeting. But we are pleased to welcome you this evening to review the WISD budget for our full board and for our community. So welcome, Brian. I know also that Ms. Minnick, trustees, is on standby. She is also there on Zoom. So if we have questions, we'll be able to have both Mr. Marcel and Ms. Minnick to help us. Thank you for coming and welcome.
Well, good evening, and thanks for giving us the opportunity to present the ISD budget to you this evening. The presentation and the general education and special education budget resolutions and a draft resolution to either support or disapprove the general education budget was forwarded to the superintendent's office at the beginning of May. First, I want to make some general comments. The purpose of the presentation is for the board to consider the Washtenaw ISD general education budget and either to support or to disapprove that budget. And additionally, if the board has any specific comments or any recommendations or any considerations they would want to communicate to the ISD board, they can send those along with the completed resolution. And the ISD board will consider those as they review their budget before June 30th. According to Michigan law, the consideration of your board must be completed before the end of May, which is why I'm doing this today. And the resolution and any comments, recommendations, and considerations need to be returned to the ISD by June 1st. I covered what's in a lot of slides that are before the one that's showing on your screen right now. If you have a copy of the full presentation, you probably realize that. And then there's also a set of slides that are starting on about slide 10 that discuss some of the main program areas that are funded by our general education fund. And there are notes that are in that presentation document. Feel free to go through those and the PowerPoint covers a lot of details about that. Given that this normal presentation, if Trustee Kelly or Gaynor can verify, it takes about 40 minutes to do. I am not going to do that to you today. So I'm going to focus mainly on the budget portion of this presentation, which starts on slide 18, which is the one that's up right now. So as I mentioned when I was talking, we are required to present the general education budget for you. And you can see that on the bottom of your screen. That is the smaller section. And just for transparency purposes and for what we feel is an important part of what our work is here at the ISD, we also present the special education budget. You can see the top half. And you can see why we present that, because it's 4 times larger than our general education budget. And so we want to make sure the board gets a full picture of what it is that's happening at the ISD. The general education budget, the one we need to focus on, you'll see the magenta bar there is the expenditures and the blue bar, darker blue bar is revenue. And you'll see that the magenta bar, the expenditures are greater than what our planned revenues are. For this coming budget for 22-23, we're planning to spend, well, I should say we're budgeting to expend, and you all understand what a budget is, about $860,000 of our fund balance. And at the end of the year, you'll see that it leaves us about $3.3 million. That's about a 10.8% fund balance, just for reference purposes. But there's some peculiarities related to our general education fund. We have a ton of grant funding that is in this budget. About 25 million of that $30 million is all grant funding. And if we were to not be doing grant funding anymore, whatever those operations are, we would not do those anymore. So the remaining piece, that 5 million, is what we really consider our sort of our operational budget for our general education fund. And so if you think about a $3.3 million budget over a $5 million budget, that gets us closer to about a 60% fund balance in regards to the way we sort of look at what our fund balance is. And we'll talk more about the general education fund later, but we're going to jump into special ed and general ed first here in the combined expenditure graph. For next year, you'll see the number at the bottom of the pie, $159 million is the combined budget between those two general education and special education programs. And you'll notice some really large sections of that pie. The one on the left, they're all kind of blue. It's the one that says funds transferred to local districts. That section of the pie is actually what it says. There are actual dollars that are being transferred to our local districts, primarily in public school academies. Primarily, the big piece of that is going to be the reimbursement for your local special education costs that are in the Ann Arbor schools budget. Then on the bottom section, you have the little lighter blue section, which is earmarked grants and projects. Those are various grants and projects that we use those funds to operate programs that are operated on behalf of your students and our students that we educate here at the ISD. And then we have the next darker blue section on the right-hand side, which is direct special education services. So those are going to be our operational programs in special ed that you would think of as High Point School, as our Progress Park, the Red Oak facility in downtown Ann Arbor, as well as teacher consultants and other staff that we deploy throughout the county to assist with the education of students with disabilities. And then you can see all the remaining pieces. I'm not going to spend a lot of time given our time constraints, but in summary, if you look at the note on the left-hand side in blue, if you add the three big blue sections, it's almost 92% of our budget that is either funds transferred directly to you as a reimbursement, direct special education services for students that are in your programs or in our programs, or our earmarked grants and projects that are operated on behalf of the students that we serve. So we're going to start with the special education fund, and you can see this is the revenue side of things, since we just talked about expenditures. And it's obvious where most of our funding comes from. It is local funding. About $97.3 million of that $98 million yellow bar is property taxes. So that is the funds that we collect on behalf of the operation of our programs, as well as that reimbursement that goes out to our local districts and public school academies. We're planning for next year there to be about when we did the budget was done in February. We were originally projecting to have about a 2% increase in our property tax revenue for 22-23. Now that we actually have our taxable valuations, that number is going to be closer to about 5.2%. So it's actually going to be about 3% higher than what we were originally budgeting, which it turns out to be close to $3 million in additional funding that we'll have. There's not currently reflected in this budget, but will be in our budget amendment when we do that later this year. The purple bar is our state funding. And just as your district and all the other local school districts receive a reimbursement from the state of Michigan for operating special education programs, the ISD receives that similar reimbursement. It's legally obligated to be at least 28.6% of what our special education costs are. And as you know, the State Aid Act has allocated additional funding this past year, couple of years. It's now 2% and is projected to be, it's 3% now, it was 2% last year. But that funding is in that section. We also receive, as you do, Section 147C, which sounds very technical, but it's the state funding that we receive, just as you receive, to help out to offset the retirement costs for the unfunded accrued actuarial liability that's accrued over the past 50 years. The Other piece that we get, if you recall, there were some changes to the local property tax, personal property tax regulations, and we're receiving a payment of about $650,000 to help offset those changes in those rules. The red section is our federal funding, and then the Special Education Fund. That's going to be primarily our Individuals with Disabilities Education Act funding, IDEA funding, which is our flow through and preschool grant. About 11 million of that 14.5 ends up being in that section that is the earmarked grants and projects, is actually funds that are transferred to you, again, to help offset your local special education costs as well as the other districts. It's $11 million in total for the county. And then this year, we're actually 22-23, we're going to get about $2.4 million in IDEA, American Rescue Plan funding. The ISD didn't receive much funding. We did not receive any ESSER funding. We got some for our Head Start program, but nothing as a general allocation for us or for our special education programs. Our funding came through the IDEA grant, ARP grant. So we're getting about $2.4 million, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this next graph, as I mentioned, we are sending reimbursement out to our local districts and public school academies. And this gives a historic perspective of where that reimbursement has been. That's the green section of the bar, is the reimbursement that the local districts and public school academies receive over the past years, going back to 2014 and what we're projecting for the future. The red section of the graph is that IDEA grant piece that I mentioned, as well as there's another grant that we get that we pass through the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. It's about another $2 million a year. That's in that red section. And you can see the important piece to see here is that on towards the very bottom of the graph, you'll see the words actual and budget. So everything 2021 and prior is based on actual experience. Everything 2022 and forward, because we're still in that year, is based on a budget. Historically, we don't end up spending all of our budget, and the reimbursement ends up being higher. So while it shows going from $74 million as a reimbursement to all the districts and PSAs in 2021, and then going down to $65 million, as a note, we actually sent an additional payment out after we closed the books for the year of about $8 million last year. So I'm projecting that it will be maybe not $8 million, but it will get us significantly closer to the $74 million by the time we're done with this fiscal year. The other odd things you will see if you look back further, well, what happened in 2015? So prior to that, the ISD would maintain a fund balance that sort of fluctuated, and we had a reimbursement policy of reimbursing a specific percentage of a district's unreimbursed costs. So you get money from IDEA, you get money from the state. The piece that's left is that unreimbursed portion. And we used to say, oh, well, we're going to reimburse 70% of whatever your unreimbursed costs are, and our fund balance would fluctuate depending on how that calculation came out. In 2015, or the very end of 2014, the Washtenaw Superintendent's Association made a recommendation to our board to not have that fluctuation anymore and to establish a target fund balance for our special education fund. And that has been set now. It's $3 million is what our target fund balance is in our special education fund. So as we get additional revenue, or as we get additional, or we spend less money, all of the excess ends up getting distributed. And that was that $8 million piece that I referred to. What happened in 2014-15 is we had a fund balance that was higher than $3 million. And what we did is we spent that down in 2014-15 to get that fund balance target down to that target of $3 million. And then the other thing to note is of course, what happened in the year 2016-17. And that was when we passed the countywide millage. There was a 1.5% increase in the special education millage. And as you can see how that impacted the reimbursement that went out to all the local districts and public school academies. We're going to look a little bit more at this reimbursement. And so some of the things that are interesting is, so what funds it, as you saw on the revenue graph, is primarily property taxes. So what we put on this graph is a history of sort of what's happened with property taxes. And you can see that bump that I just mentioned in 2016-17 when we passed the 1.5 mils. You can also see that what we call a restatement is when we spent that fund balance down. So what this graph is showing you is on the right-hand side, the property tax revenue is on that axis. On the left-hand side is the percentage of reimbursement. So it's the percentage every district, well, all the districts aggregated together are receiving as a reimbursement from us as a percentage of their unreimbursed costs. So I mentioned that 70% number back in 2014-15. You can kind of see that on the graph. If you look up in 2012-13, you can kind of see that number. So that payment we made in 14-15 was a restatement of the 13-14 year as we closed it, and then we distributed the money in 14-15. As I mentioned, you can see the increase in 16-17, not only in the property tax revenue, but what that did for that countywide reimbursement percentage, taking around 95%. And then you can kind of see the ups and downs. And you're like, well, why do the ups and downs happen? Well, they have happened for two reasons. Three reasons. One is property tax revenue. The other is the programs the ISD needs to operate. And then the other thing is, what are the actual local district costs that are happening? And so all three of those factors end up influencing how that graph goes. You'll see a little unusual thing that happened. We got very close to 100% in 2020-21, which is the last actual year that we were done. That percentage is actually about 98.6%. And it went up at a faster pace than sort of what even the property taxes went up. And it was because some of the costs in our local districts actually went down. Some of that had to do with the pandemic. And so because of that reduction in costs, and there were, several districts had vacancies, positions they were unable to fill. And so that caused that percentage to go up. And then, of course, because these 21-22 and 22-23, as I mentioned earlier, are budget years, that reimbursement dollar amount you saw go from 74 million to 68 million. That's why that percentage ends up dropping. But as I mentioned, we're likely to have an increase in what that reimbursement will be by the time we end up closing out the year with that target fund balance of $3 million. One more look at that outgoing transfer. This is a very similar graph, but instead of mapping property taxes, it maps those local special education costs that I was referring to. You can see that drop in the 2021 bar, where our costs actually went down, and you can see the opposing impact that had on our reimbursement percentage, because our property taxes did not drop, and so that caused that percentage to go higher. And again, you can see the drop, as I referred to on the last slides, for the budget years of 2021 and 22. So overall, on the special education fund, this is on the revenue side. As I mentioned, we were originally budgeting for an increase in property taxes of 2%. And as I said, it's now going to be closer to 5.2%. So we're going to have that 3% increase, which will most of it end up going out to local districts and public school academies. We did have an increase in our officer retirement services, the retirement system funding, that 147C. That funding went up for the year. And then if you've been paying attention legislatively to next year's budget, obviously you do for foundation allowance, but they were also planning the governor's proposal was to increase the special education reimbursement from an additional 3% to an additional 8%. We didn't include any of that in our budget assumption. So if something were to happen where that number increases above 3%, that will also provide us additional revenue to help offset costs or to increase the reimbursement out to local districts and public school academies. Also on the revenue side, we generally in our budget don't assume any federal grant carryover. And as I mentioned, we are getting the one-time American Rescue Plan grant IDEA funds. And the decision was made, again, with consultation with the Washtenaw Superintendents Association, to fund a new program that we're starting in the county. We've looked at our breadth of services that we've had, and one of the suggestions from all of the special education directors and the superintendents is to have a centralized program for students that are on the autism spectrum with significant behavioral challenges. And so we're going to put that IDEA funding to start up that program and actually to fund part of the first year. And as I mentioned, it's $2.4 million. On the expenditure side, in the special education fund, I just mentioned that program. I mentioned it's partial funding. The total cost of that program will be about $3.4 million. So there will be about $1 million that will have to be funded out of the other revenue that we receive from property taxes and state special education revenue. And then another recommendation that the superintendents had was to have some countywide professional development in the area of special education. It's not been completely solidified as to what that is going to look like yet, but they were planning to put $750,000 of our budget behind that effort. We also added approximately 3.5 additional instructional and instructional support positions to meet various behavioral, medical, and IEP needs of the students that come to our programs. We also added 1 additional teacher consultant position we have a cadre of teacher consultants that go out to all the districts and public school academies. And we needed to add 1 more position to help them with their technical assistance. And then we're decreasing 1 teacher assistant position in one of our programs due to a reduced need in that program. And then you are likely aware that we had an interim superintendent for a period of time, and we've now transitioned to a permanent superintendent. The ISD actually has several properties that we rent. We own the properties that are on Wagner Road, but most of our other facilities are all rental expense for us. There's been a change in the GASB regulations, and where we would normally have something as a rent expense, it would have showed up in our operations and maintenance budget. Because of GASB 87, they've now reclassified that to be like debt. So we have to book it, and we have to book a corresponding debt related to a lease. And now we're going to have to reclassify those as opposed to operations and maintenance expenses to something that's going to be down in the debt payment section. So if you were to look at our budget, you would see an odd sort of increase that would happen down there and potentially a corresponding decrease in our operations and maintenance budget. We always assume all our vacancies will be filled. We're in bargaining right now, but we're assuming that there will be step increases. We're currently including a 1.5% wage increase based on formulas that are existing in our bargaining agreements. We have an increase of 3.5% for healthcare for the year. We are self-funded, and the 3.5% would also correspond to the PA 152 limit of how much an employer can increase to pay for public employees' health insurance. And then, as I mentioned, the local district reimbursement, we're currently budgeting that to be about $63 million. For this year's budget in 21-22, districts are currently planning on getting about $62.7 million. So it actually ends up being a fairly flat picture, even though that number showed a drop on that one graph. And this is our boring special education graph on our fund balance. As I mentioned, we had a target fund balance now, and so you can see how it's flattened out after we made that disbursement in 14-15. On the general ed side, this graph looks dramatically different. And you can see most of our funding does not come from property taxes here. The local property tax portion of that 2.7 million yellow bar is about $1.8 million, somewhere in between there. That also reflects the 2% increase that I talked about earlier when we were talking about special education. The rest of that funding that comes in there is related to professional development revenue. We do fingerprinting services. We get some community and foundation resources for Success by Six, Washtenaw, My Brother's Keeper, education project for homeless youth has some local funding as well. So that makes up the rest of that 2.7 million. The 1.7 million green bar is what we consider sort of our operational funding. If you were to look in the State Aid Act, that is Section 81 in the State Aid Act, and it tends to follow around what's going to happen with foundation allowance, and most of the recommendations have been in the 4 to 5% range. So we've included a 5% increase in our Section 51 funding, or Section 81 funding, sorry. The next piece is the purple bar, which is about almost $13 million. As I mentioned, the funding in the general education fund is significant grant funding, and you can see that in the purple and the red bars when you add those together. So the 12.9 million is primarily funding for the Great Start Readiness Program, which is about 7.7 million of that 12.9. We also get about $2 million, $2.2 million for adult education funding. We also receive some 31N mental health funding that we're assisting the local districts with those needs. And that's currently about $820,000 that we're receiving in that funding. The red bar, the federal piece, is mainly the Head Start grant. About 6 million of that 8.1 million is that Head Start grant. We also receive some federal funding for Perkins for career and technical education programs. Part of that is actually distributed to Ann Arbor to help offset the costs of your career and technical education programs. We receive some SNAP Ed funding, which is mainly around health education. We're also receiving currently some COVID health resource advocate funding. It's about $1 million of that $8 million. And then the incoming transfer piece, the gray bar at the end, of about $4 million, includes mainly things related to technology. We do a lot of cooperative purchasing on behalf of our districts, as well as for not only hardware and other things like that, software, but for the Michigan Virtual University classes, that funding, we're a pass-through, and we end up paying the bill, and then you get the benefit of having those classes at a more affordable rate than if you were to get those on your own. And the other piece that's in there is we operate the technology departments for the Ypsilanti and Lincoln school districts. So the revenue we get to help offset those costs that are in our general education fund are in that $4 million. So on the revenue side in general education, as I mentioned, the property taxes, we budgeted for 2%. The state special education or Section 81 funding, we budgeted a 5% increase. We did have a drop in our state funding. We used to be the statewide fiscal agent for the kindergarten readiness assessment funding. That is now not going to be in existence anymore, and that funding will not be coming to us. It was about $1 million. So if you were to notice a drop in our state grant funding, that would be the reason for that. But it is now offset by the fact that we're getting this health resource advocate funding. Of course, that's federal. That is also, as I mentioned earlier, about $1 million. And then similar to our special education fund, we generally don't include grant revenue carryover. However, we are doing that for our 31N funding just because of the way the state's accounting for that. It's just easier for us to keep that in our budget as opposed to letting it lapse and budgeting at the end of the year next year. On the expenditure side, we had, again, expenditures lower related to those same grant changes that were on the previous slide. The expenditure side also has the change for the health resource advocate funding. We're now going to be fully staffed in our achievement initiatives area. We have not been fully staffed in that department for at least a year and a half, almost 2 years now. And then we're also able to reduce substitute costs, which have been historically in our budget, in our curriculum and instruction networks that we operate on behalf of our local districts, because a lot of the work is being done virtually now. And there's generally not as much of a need for there to be substitutes in classrooms because of that work being done virtually and generally off hours. As I mentioned on the special ed side, we've transitioned to a full permanent superintendent now. And then the same assumptions on wages and benefits are there for the general education fund that were there for special education. So this is the history of our general education fund balance. You can see we generally somewhere fall between, $2.5 million to almost $5 million. That tends to be in that range. You'll see our last actual year, 2021, we're at $4.9 million. And our budget for this year shows us to be at $4.1 million. Based on where we are this year, we will not be at 4.1 million. We'll be in a better position than that. And then, as I mentioned, as a budget year for 2023, we're showing to be about $3.3 million. But if 2022 is higher, that will also bring that number up. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about our history in our general education fund of our budget and why that downward trend probably shouldn't concern you as much as it might, as you might think. So this shows a history of what we thought was going to happen, assuming, again, we're filling all our vacancies, all our wages are going to be there. We're not doing grant carryovers. We're not budgeting for any new grants. So that is all taken to an account on our original budget numbers. And then the blue bars are where we actually ended up for each of those years. And you can see that for the last 5 years, we were budgeting for there to be a reduction of fund balance. However, in each of those 5 years, we ended up with an increase of fund balance. And there are various reasons for that. Some of them I just mentioned, but we only spend about 65% of that non-grant piece, that $5 million piece that I talked about at the beginning. About 65% of that is spent on salaries and benefits compared to a local district that's at 80 or 90%. So in addition to normal vacancies that we have for positions, which often generate budget savings, we also have some flexibility in our spending since more of the expenditures are for purchase services. And we're able to save money. Sometimes we've found different providers for doing professional development, or our own staff have done some of the presentations themselves as opposed to using other outside people. And we're already paying for their salaries, so we don't end up spending that professional or the contracted service funds that were in the budget. We're also able to leverage our relationships to obtain services in a more affordable way. That's part of what that using our own people to be able to do that, to make those presentations. And then, as I mentioned, using staff instead of contracted services. We've also been really good about obtaining additional grant funding. And as I mentioned, we're not budgeting for new grants that we don't know about right now, or that we haven't been awarded yet. And sometimes those awards happen after the beginning of the fiscal year. But we've been really good about getting grants and being able to fund things that are important to our staff, that are important to our board about what we're doing in our general education fund. And the grants align with what that effort is and what that direction is. And so we're able to utilize that grant funding to help offset part of people's salaries. So that is a big reason as to why some of these the circumstances have happened where we've ended up having a positive budget variance as opposed to a negative one. And then one more here. The other piece is, so what happens in our general education fund if we were to actually really start spending all of our fund balance like that? And what I did is I broke apart our general education budget, just that piece, that $5 million piece, that's not the grants. And I broke it down into 3 categories of what are we required to do? What is more operational costs? And I'll explain all these in a second. And then what is quote unquote discretionary. So the required things are going to be expenditures that we're required to do by law. So we're required to have a superintendent. We're required to have a school board. We're required to have a truancy officer. We're required to perform pupil accounting audits. And so all of those things are regulated and we need to do those. So those all fall into that gray required section. The operational piece is going to be things like the business office, the HR office, our internal technology, facilities for our teaching and learning center building, our event services department, communications, that kind of thing. Those are more in the operational section. And then we have a section of our budget that's available to do with what our administration and board end up making decisions as to how to spend that money. And it's generally all aligned with the efforts of what our mission is and what our board intends to do with that. And a lot of it is spent in our achievement initiatives department and our assessment department on things that are going to help districts with their school improvement, with their curriculum efforts. And so that I mentioned those networks earlier, and you can, again, on those earlier slides that we didn't cover, you can look at some of that work, but that's where most of that discretionary funding is spent. It's not discretionary in that we don't have to do it. It's very intentional as to how that funding is getting spent. But what it does do is say, well, if something were to happen with our budget, it's not like we have a bunch of funding that's locked up in people that we don't, that we might not need to, that would be more difficult to go through a reduction. We have about $2.5 million where we would be able to say, well, if we do have a budget issue, we're not going to just do this thing anymore. Would that potentially impact a person? Yes. But because of all the contracted services, it would impact staff much, much less. And then to give a little more perspective, I mentioned on our general education fund, the staffing piece is a smaller portion. You can see the red piece of the pie there is about 27% purchase services, and then supplies and materials and capital outlay. But this point is that the staff piece is and staff and benefits is not at the same 80 to 90% level. And that's all I had, unless anyone had any specific questions. Be happy to answer those.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marcel. We will be taking care of this later on this evening.
Okay, great. Have a good evening.
Thank you.